Good morning. My name's Alec Cameron. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of RMIT University, and it's my great honour this morning to introduce a truly inspirational figure in our sector at an international level, and a former colleague from the UK, Baroness Valerie Amos. I first met Valerie in 2016 when I joined the university's UK plenary, of which she was a member as Director of SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, a self-governing institution within the University of London. Valerie's current role is Master of University College, Oxford, to which she was appointed in September 2020, which is a second point of connection for me, as University College is my alma mater from my graduate studies in Oxford, albeit more than 3 decades before Baroness Amos took up her role. Notwithstanding these very significant roles within higher education, they cap a lifetime of contribution, during which Valerie has sustained an interest in and commitment to issues of equity and social justice. Her career has spanned local and national government in the UK, as well as global leadership in her role as Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations. She also served as UK High Commissioner to Australia from 1994 to 1998, during which time she's well known to several people here in Canberra, and I might specifically call out Margaret Shield, whose term as CEO of the ARC in Canberra overlapped with Valerie's posting. More particularly for our audience today, Valerie maintains a passion for the profound way education can change lives. As a result, she has involved herself in issues relating to diversity and inclusion and decolonising the curriculum. Along with her sister, she co-founded the Amos Bursary in 2008 to give talented young people of African and Caribbean heritage the opportunity to realise their aspirations. She also sits on the board of the MasterCard Foundation, the UN Foundation, Institute for Government, and the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. And in 2022, she was appointed a Companion of the Order of the Garter. Valerie, thank you so much for travelling to be with us. It's an honour to invite you to give your keynote.
Good morning, everyone. I have to tell you, the lights are so bright up here, I can barely see anyone. But Alec, thank you so much for that introduction. I do have to tell you that you got one date wrong. I was High Commissioner in Australia from 2009 to 2010, when I was plucked out to go to the UN. So I was here for less than a year, but I did experience 3 prime ministers. It's a real pleasure to be back in Australia and to be able to address such a distinguished audience. We all know how strong the higher education sector is here in Australia, and what I'm going to try to do this morning is be a little bit parochial in the sense that quite a lot of what I've got to say tries to connect my experience at the United Nations and some of the issues that I had to address there with my experience coming into higher education from that kind of global role, and to focus on some of the global issues that I dealt with then in 2015 when I became Director of SOAS, which are still relevant today. And end by saying a little bit about issues around equality, diversity and inclusion, which are very much a passion for me. So my focus this morning really is on the type of leadership now required by those heading universities and other higher education institutions in a challenging and at times volatile global political context. As we all scrambled to transform our institutions in March 2020 and continue some semblance of normalcy in the midst of a pandemic with long-standing economic well-being and social impact, the words I had used time after time in speeches about potential major risks, that of a pandemic with no respect for borders, came to pass. And despite not really being ready, most of us did a pretty good job as we put student experience and staff welfare at the top of our agendas. There was collective working, sharing, remember all of those hours on Zoom. Faculty who generally presented as being in the dark ages when it came to tech, adapted, learned new skills. It's not an experience any of us wants to repeat, despite the changed landscape for reform which it created. And as I prepared for this speech, it struck me that in the last few years, more and more university leaders have been in the spotlight, sometimes for the wrong reason, related to the way that they have managed the fallout in their institutions from global events. And it's not a new phenomenon. So I'd like to give some examples from my own experience. When I left the UN in 2015, after 5 years responsible for coordinating the response to humanitarian crises around the world, I didn't anticipate that in my new role as Director of SOAS, University of London, and later as Master of an Oxford College, that global politics would continue to play such a central role in my working life. Indeed, that issues I dealt with in a humanitarian context would have such an impact on higher education and raise so many questions about the nature and purpose of our sector. At the UN, I led the response to crises caused by war, conflict, and natural disasters. Millions of people affected and displaced every day. There were proxy wars, governments in denial, and always the people, very often left homeless and without basic services. I had to be a strong advocate, a skilled negotiator. Building strong relationships was key to operational and political success. It's a job that I loved, was exhausting, and used every skill that I had. But it also taught me a lot about humanity. I expected global, but a somewhat quieter global when I moved into the HE sector. I'd been hired to use my knowledge of various parts of the world to give SOAS's work more visibility, to make connections, to build partnerships and collaborations, to use the collective power of SOAS alumni to position SOAS internationally, and of course, to raise money. Those of you who are aware of SOAS know that it's dynamic, very left of center, activist, political, and difficult. Whilst the majority of alumni around the world, and indeed current students, speak fondly of their time there and the different perspectives that are at the center of the teaching, it can be a tricky place to navigate. And it's certainly not a comfortable place in which to be a leader. In my time, there was huge mistrust of management and reluctance to embrace any reform to address the academic and financial challenges which the institution faced. My job, as a virtue of circumstances, became more weighted internally than externally. But I found out that those weren't the biggest challenges. These came in the form of attacks from government ministers and other stakeholders, and they linked back to the government's foreign policy agenda and its domestic impact. The first example linked to the terrorism agenda. One of the first things I had to deal with was the assertion from then Prime Minister David Cameron that SOAS, along with Queen Mary, King's College, and Kingston universities, had hosted hate preachers who undermined British values. There was no evidence to back up his statement. It turned out that one controversial cleric had visited SOAS the year before, in 2014, to speak on Islamic finance. That naming and shaming took place as he unveiled a new duty for universities to stop extremists targeting students and ensure that speakers with extremist views did not go unchallenged. It was cheap politics, creating a fear of some universities as somehow un-British because of their diversity and the readiness of academics to challenge government's simplistic assertion of facts in countries which were in fact rooted in complexity. There were academics at SOAS who were steeped in the history and contemporary politics of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Theirs was a perspective worth understanding, not shunning. A prime example of academic knowledge and experience which could have helped policymaking being ignored. My next example speaks to an issue which has been on the front pages of newspapers in most parts of the world since the horrendous attacks on Israel by Hamas in October and Israel's retaliation in Gaza and the West Bank. Universities in the US, UK, Australia, Middle East, and elsewhere have become the site of struggle of students from different sides. And regrettably, it has become about sides. It's been hard to sustain a balanced view because of the intensity of the emotion and the history. And social media has been filled day after day with misinformation and hate. 2 university presidents in the US have lost their jobs. Philanthropic funding to some institutions has been withdrawn. The pain and consequences will take years to heal, if ever, and we still have no end to the conflict in sight. I experienced some of this on a smaller scale when I was at SOAS. The pro-Palestinian stance taken by many students and some faculty, their criticisms of the Israeli government, and support for the BDS campaign meant that SOAS as an institution was branded anti-Semitic by some. This, despite SOAS being one of the few places in the country with a Centre for Jewish Studies, which provided the intellectual home for the MA in Israeli Studies, doctoral and academic research, a centre which existed alongside a Centre for Palestine Studies, which provided an institutional home for the study of Palestine and Palestinians across disciplines. The academic collaborations, discussions, and debates could get heated, but it was good to see. What was not was the way some students treated each other and the lack of respect they sometimes showed when outside the classroom. And Jewish students who were in a minority sometimes did not identify themselves as such, and understandably found it difficult to walk through big pro-Palestinian demonstrations and vigils to get into our building. I faced considerable personal criticism when I met the Israeli ambassador on campus and was told by some students who supported the Palestinian cause that I had made the campus unsafe for them. One of the biggest demonstrations took place when I refused to cancel the visit of the then Israeli ambassador, who was due to speak at an event organized by one of our student societies. The student union thought I would cancel it on security grounds. I advised students who felt that he should not visit and had a case to answer that they should attend and ask questions about his record. For university leaders, these are the real-world consequences of political discourse we are now facing on a regular basis. It may be India, Pakistan, Ukraine, Russia. Students from Myanmar, Sudan, Afghanistan, any one of a number of places in the world worried about family, friends, the state of democracy in their country. How we respond will set the tone for decades to come. It's real time playing out as well as replay of political struggles elsewhere, but with immediate consequences for the way we lead and manage our universities. I saw this with the outpouring of support for Ukraine and the Ukrainians with this full-scale invasion of Russia by Ukraine, a place I visited with the initial invasion in 2014 when I was at the UN. In Europe and elsewhere in the world, we couldn't believe it. War in our region. Some governments, as well as national bodies, flew Ukrainian flags, prompting questions about why the same hadn't been done in other conflicts. At my college, we've housed a Ukrainian family, supported a master's scholarship program, employed Ukrainian staff fleeing the conflict, and supported academic staff still in Ukraine. I've seen the desperation of students who have fled their countries. For example, Syria and Afghanistan. Syria, a place I visited 7 times, and where people constantly said to me, "Why has the world forgotten us?" And their despair that they will never have the opportunity to conclude their degrees. It's an issue we're much more conscious of now, but for a long time, students weren't considered a priority, given the urgency of just keeping people alive. But as wars drag on for years and years, it's something we must give attention to, or blot the lives of future generations in some of the most fragile countries in the world. And only a couple of months ago, I was involved in discussions about whether or not we should be thinking about creating a university for refugees. I'm not sure it's the right way forward, but it's good that people are thinking about it. Freedom of speech has been a touchstone issue for successive Conservative governments in the United Kingdom because of a handful of high-profile cases which have received considerable media attention. It's become an issue, a kind of stick with which to beat universities. Instead of a grown-up conversation about the challenges facing higher education, including, for example, the short and long-term consequences of Brexit, the focus has been on issues of identity politics. Despite freedom of expression already being protected under our Human Rights Act and Education Act of 1986, the government recently introduced the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill, which became law in 2023. As 2 of my fellow heads of house of Oxford colleges wrote, and I quote, "This bill is part of a pattern of weakening institutions of accountability by imposing impossible burdens on them. This is a response to a non-problem. A recent review of 10,000 speaker events across universities found only 6 that had been cancelled, of which 4 were due to incorrect paperwork. The bill is about allowing those who have been deprived of a platform but who have ample funds to claim damages from universities and student unions," end quote. Cue the culture wars and accusations of wokeism to intimidate individuals and institutions, not just universities, as they seek to debate and redress historic atrocities and contemporary inequalities. Challenging accepted national narratives and opening up our societies to self-reflection is hard. It requires strong leadership, evidence, and data. But it also requires empathy It's not a blame game. Societies which are prepared to engage in these conversations are healthier societies, and they deal with their areas of inequality in a more positive way. Senior leaders in higher education require political acumen, an understanding of global challenges around the world and how they affect staff and students. Universities are a key part of a world that is both increasingly connected and disconnected, one where opportunities can quickly become threats and vice versa. Funding challenges are not just local, they're also global, with a dependence of so many universities on a steady flow of international students. But over time, that will change, particularly at undergraduate level, as countries in the global south strengthen their education sectors. We're already seeing it in India, and what will happen next in China and Hong Kong. Part of the result of COVID-19 is the greater acceptance of online and hybrid learning. Students still want that face-to-face experience. We see that in Oxford. The interaction with each other as well as their tutors and engagement with the city is part of the draw. But an Oxford education is expensive. Groups of 2, 3, 4, sometimes only one student with their tutor. Colleges can only afford it because they have endowments, and those that don't are constantly struggling for cash. So we know that our model of education is going to change. And it's clear from the report of the Accord that I've just been listening to that there's going to be transformation in Australia as well. Universities are complex organizations with a multitude of stakeholders. The issues facing them are not just about student numbers and funding, the balance of teaching and research. They're fundamentally about our future, about knowledge, power, values, about fairness, inclusivity, and opportunity, prompting yet more debate about our purpose, with some branding us as communities of elites, lacking understanding of and empathy with real-world problems. And yet, we are manifestly so much more than that. Right now, we have a crucial role in encouraging our students to support democratic principles which are being undermined in so many parts of the world. Time magazine describes 2024 as not just an election year, and I quote, "It is perhaps the election year, as more voters than ever in history head to the polls in at least 64 countries, representing a combined population of about 49% of people in the world." We've already seen elections in Taiwan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, with more to come, including Russia, the United States, United Kingdom, South Africa, Republic of Korea, and so many more. Why does this matter to us? Because part of our job is to protect democratic principles, grow the leaders of the future, grow research collaborations which have the potential to significantly change the world. University leaders today are not just negotiating the tramlines of the local, regional, and national political landscape. We're having to negotiate our way around global politics and a global political context fraught with difficulty. As we saw with COVID-19, some issues don't respect borders. I've already mentioned conflicts, but there's also climate change and environmental degradation. All have their impact. It's not just about teaching, learning, and research. It's about rights, equality, freedom. The global agenda is our agenda as educators, change makers, and dare I say it, as disruptors. It's about protecting the best that we have whilst challenging conventional orthodoxies, thinking outside the box, thinking about solutions to deliver equity. I don't believe, and I know that you don't either, that education is just about getting our young people work ready. It's about ideas, curiosity, knowledge exchange, interdisciplinary working, about the sciences, humanities, and social sciences and the arts. And whilst we're negotiating this broader global political backdrop, we're also dealing with the day-to-day, funding, student expectations and experiences, recruitment and retention, the competition between us, needing to engage strategically on scenarios looking at the future. AI, equality, diversity, and inclusion, which I must say a little more about. Because I've been proud at Oxford to see the way that we have tackled that issue. Knowing that academic excellence and diversity can go hand in hand. Our Opportunity Oxford programme is a bridging programme which works to support young people who get the same grade offers as others, but there is a recognition that they will need additional support before they actually start at Oxford, to get used to the environment at Oxford, to develop their skills because of the kind of school that they went to, perhaps in an area of Britain that was with socioeconomic disadvantage, where they did not have the same kind of advantages as those who went to independent or excellent state schools. And that bridging programme has been extremely successful, bringing in an additional 200 students a year. And as I said, they come in on the same grades as other students. It's not that they are not bright enough. It is about the consequences of the impact of the disadvantages that they face, be it about ethnicity or in relation to socioeconomic factors. When I joined the HE sector, I was struck by several things. Most notably, the need for greater diversity in the sector's leadership. I couldn't believe that in 2015, I was the first Black person to head a British university. I found it harder to believe, I think, because I had come straight from an international role. There was also the lack of serious government attention to a sector contributing so much to the UK economy and the UK's soft power globally. Since 2015 in the UK, we've had something like 9 Secretaries of State for Education and 6 university ministers. 8, if you count the fact that 2 of them served twice, 1 for 3 days. And my favourite thing that I learned when I joined, and has been repeated to me several times by different academic colleagues, but with slightly different wording, was that an academic said to me that what he really, really wanted to do was to live in cloisters. Others have said monasteries, and that my role was to protect them from the constraints of regulation. They wanted to be left alone and not have to deal with all that real-world stuff. Well, I'm afraid it's a reality we all have to face. But let me finish on a positive note. There are so many examples of innovation, flexibility, adaptability, and agility in our sector. We should be proud, but not complacent. There's a lot to do and so much still to learn. But that's what education is all about. That's what we are all about. Thank you.
Now, I'm relying on the audience here because whilst I have some questions for Valerie, I know there will be better questions from the audience, so please get on the app if you want to participate in the conversation. We've got about 12 or 13 minutes for questions and answers. Valerie, I might just sort of start off where you finished, which is obviously you covered a range of challenges and issues that we're facing globally in higher education. But you did end on a very positive note, right? And I think, personally, and I think I speak for most people in the room, we actually feel inspired to work in higher education because of the positive benefit that we can realise. So what are the things that most excite and enthuse you at the moment? In your role, what are the things that help you get out of bed in the morning and do the good work?
Well, the first thing that gets me out of bed actually is the students. I'm just amazed at not just their intellectual ability, the fact that they're prepared to work so hard, but also just the range of interests that they have, and their interest in, being better citizens. And there's a lot that's said about young people today that, they're snowflakes and everything else. That is not my experience. And I feel so strongly that we are leaving them a world that is quite frankly a bit of a mess. But I have real confidence actually in their ability to do the kinds of things that they need to do to make it fairer, better, globally, actually.
Good. Questions are starting to come through, so I'll encourage people to continue to contribute. The first question actually is one that ties into a question I had, which is, you have been personally an advocate for diversity through your whole career and have been very successful. What advice would you give us? I think that the first question says, look, we've yet to experience an Indigenous Vice-Chancellor in the Australian system. How can we do better? If you got any advice that you'd like to give to us as to how we might push further?
Well, you have to be serious about it. I think that's the first thing. I was interviewed when I became head of SOAS, and, one of the questions was, why had it taken so long? And I think it took so long because, quite frankly, there wasn't enough work that was done to identify the people in the system and build a pipeline that would bring individuals through into leadership positions. They're there, but very often they're invisible. So I think seriousness is the first thing. I think we have to get off, and I feel this so strongly, that what I see in the UK is very often this one word, merit, used as a way, basically, of making people feel that they're not good enough because their experience is different, because they have different kinds of perspectives. And I've seen it in so many institutions where people who have the potential aren't given the opportunity because they are different, because they bring something different, because they haven't had the same trajectory as those who are traditionally in the role. So the first thing I would say is you have to be serious about it, you have to want it, you have to identify the people with the potential, you have to make sure that they get trained, that they have the right kinds of work experience, and you have to listen to what they say about the nature of the stereotyping and discrimination that they face on a day-to-day basis. I mean, even today, people come up to me and they kind of look at me and ask me, well, how did you do that, in a voice of, complete surprise, as if somehow I haven't worked hard, I haven't done well in the jobs that I've done, and I don't deserve to be where I am. And you have to have such resilience to be able to push back against that, because it's kind of constant. It's a way of just chipping away at you and chipping away at you and chipping away at you. And the other thing I would say is that those of us who do get through the door, we can't slam it shut. We've got to leave it open and encourage others to come in after us. I always say to young people that I talk to, yes, it's difficult, but believe you me, having the power is so much better than not having it.
Good. One of the other questions that's come online is something we feel very much as a sector at the moment, which is, to be quite frank, that we don't feel loved by governments of either persuasion, and I know the same applies in the UK. And we are continually, in some sense, on the back foot. We're responding to issues where we feel we get pincered on culture wars issues and so forth. You've given some examples of your experiences at SOAS. What's your sense of the best advice at the moment to the sector here and to leaders within the sector represented through the room as to how we deal with, let me say, winning our social licence back, which is one of our challenges?
Yeah, so I've always said, and I think this is because perhaps I have a political background, I think that we focus too much on the government's agenda, as opposed to things that we need to do. So our communication and narrative is not as good as it should be. And that is partly because we're in competition with each other, we don't think enough about, for example, the top 6 things that we want the world, our communities and everybody else to know about us and why we're good at what we do and why higher education should be defended. So we are continually on the back foot responding to a government agenda. And it's hard for sector bodies like UUK in the UK, or indeed Universities Australia, I'm sure, because people come at these issues with slightly different perspectives, which are about their own interests. There are a number of issues where our interests are collective interests, and we have to identify those and be very clear about the messages that we want the public, our students and others to hear, including our politicians, that we want our students and their parents and others to be repeating back to our politicians. So I think we should be on offense rather than defense. It's not always going to be work, it's going to take time, but that's what I think we should be doing. Communicating our messages better, having better stories. There are great stories out there. There are always these wonderful case studies, but they're always about the individual institution rather than about our sector as a whole and the contribution that we make. And make it real. Make it about people. Make it about something that has connectivity rather than being in the abstract.
Great. As you know, the international student sector is a very important part of Australian higher education, and it was referred to by Mary O'Kane earlier. It's, it provides a significant underpinning financially, particularly for our research activity, but also in some sense to cross-subsidise our domestic services. At the same time, we feel that this is an intrinsic good that we're playing in the region through international education. But there is a counter-argument, which in some sense is about we're exacerbating the brain drain from developing countries to Australia and, through immigration and so forth. So your sense of how, in some sense, how we reconcile that or how we balance that role that we play, which is significantly beneficial at an individual level, but a little bit more questionable sometimes at a community level, particularly if many of these graduates are remaining in Australia.
Yeah, I think this is really hard, and I don't think there's one easy answer to this. Because also international education is extremely expensive. So it's very often the elites, unless you have good scholarship programs that are taking advantage of this. I think you have to be able to encourage students to go to different places. I have a kind of view which is that if we can strengthen institutions in the countries that students are coming from so that they do their undergraduate education in their home country and then move, for example, for graduate education, that is perhaps better. I particularly think that when we're looking at areas like teaching and nursing, how we support those sectors in a country so that countries are able to skill up their own nurses, doctors. Yeah. A proportion of them will stay. Not everybody wants to leave. We have a kind of assumption that everybody wants to leave their country. No, they don't. And part of our development agenda has got to be that we work with countries actually to improve their economies, to improve the amount of money that they're putting into basic services. Of course, you don't want to stay in a country where the health service is shot to pieces or where your children can't be educated. So actually, there have to be a number of different elements to the agenda moving forward. You know, one of the things that we're doing in the UK, which I don't agree with, is tightening the visa restrictions for families of graduate students as a way, actually, of discouraging graduate students from coming to the UK. I mean, actually, I think opening up work opportunities for students, you know, for a couple of years so they can take those skills back. Yes, a proportion of students will stay, but I think not the greatest proportion if we can get the support we give to the Global South right.
Fantastic. Valerie, there are many more questions. We have run out of time. You will be around afterwards.
I will, if I don't collapse from jet lag.
Exactly. So once again, if people have got questions for Valerie, you know, feel free to, you know, try and sidle up to her in the break. But at this point in time, can I thank Valerie on behalf of all of us for her fantastic contribution.
Thank you.
NAB, more than money.